Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me today. I want to tell you what happened when I went into the energy of a young man who had spent 20 years in a coma following a dreadful car accident when he was just 15 years old. He became known as the Sleeping Prince because he was a member of the Saudi royal family. He died recently, or was allowed to die recently. And I was able to do his crossover. I didn't do his transition because although he was known all over the world, he was simply known for being in a coma. Otherwise, he was a private individual, and I don't want to go too far. But it does answer one of the mysteries of life when it comes to people in a coma. Where does their consciousness go? Where are they during that time? And so I got fascinating pictures for that. And that's what the pictures are incredibly useful for, because they tap into the energy of people, of things, of events, and they give some clue to otherwise mysterious circumstances. I'll give you a good example. Somebody back in February asked me to do pictures for something called a Roman dodecahedron. There's an example of one. They are 12-sided metallic objects, hollowed out with a hole on every side and sometimes little nodules on each corner. They can be about 5 inches across, and they've been found in France and Germany and the UK as well. And they're thought to date back to Roman times. But nobody has been able to say what they're for. There have been guesses, like they're for irrigation of crops, or they're for making jewelry, or they're a candle holder, or a children's toy. There have been so many guesses. But up to this point, nobody has been able to explain what they are. And somebody said, well, you go into the energy of a Roman dodecahedron and see what you get. And I went into this one specifically. When I did, all I saw was the dodecahedron, and there was a rod or a pole sticking out of one side of it. And there was twine or a rope or a cable of some kind tied to one of the nodules. And it seemed to me that these were connectors. So that, for example, if you were putting up a tent, you'd hammer a rod into the ground and then you'd put a dodecahedron on top of that. You'd slip it over and that would be stable then and it wouldn't move around. Then you could put a stick or a rod or a pole into the hole, and that would enable you to make a tent or any kind of little covering thing where you needed to stick parts together. And I don't think they were very stable, honestly. I think they were that primitive, but in a rudimentary way, they would enable you to put up a makeshift tent or makeshift covering or a canvas awning or something. That's what that felt like. So that's a mystery that the pictures are quite useful for. When it comes to transitions and crossovers, they have been, this is the pictures, they've been very, very revealing over the 3 or 4 years that I've been doing them. They constantly surprise me because most people go through some variation of the standard transition process, it strikes me. The only person, well, not the only person, but certainly one of about 3 people who didn't was, of course, Jeffrey Epstein. And you'll find that on this channel and the other one, I've attempted to do Jeffrey Epstein's transition many times without success. He never goes through the standard process. He's always in the pictures moving around. For example, the last set I did, I think he was pinned under a moving slab of some kind, metaphorically speaking. But he was clinging to the underside so nobody could see him, And then this was lowered into a very broad concrete river-like structure, like a drainage channel. And he walked along there, found a doorway halfway down the drainage channel. Again, all metaphorical. I doubt he's in a drainage channel. But he went into this doorway, which led down some stairs into a small complex of rooms. Now, I believe that Jeffrey Epstein is dead, because that's what we've been told. Until we're told otherwise, I have to believe that, because those are current known facts. But it's certainly a mystery that I'm never able to get him to sit still. He's always walking around or moving in and out of places. So that is something I cannot explain. That's an outstanding mystery. And it was an outstanding mystery about what happens to people when they're in a coma. Maybe everybody goes through a different thing. It may be a singular experience for each individual. But since the sleeping prince passed away in July of 2025, I thought I would take a look at his crossover and see where he had been all these years. He was called Prince al-Waleed, 15 years old, member of the Saudi royal family, attending military school in London as a cadet. And unfortunately, he was involved in a terrible car crash, suffered cerebral hemorrhaging and internal bleeding, and slipped into a coma. He was flown home to Riyadh, put in a hospital there on a ventilator. And of course, his family were distraught about this. They wouldn't allow doctors to take him off the ventilator or give up on him. His father believes in divine miracles, and he brought in specialist after specialist, doctor after doctor. There were prayers around his bedside, and also from the general public. It was a very, very strong effort to keep him alive, backed by tremendous hope and expectation and prayer to bring him out of the coma. When we think of Saudi princes, we focus on the money somehow and the riches. We forget they're people. They're people who love their families and dote on their children. And his father was a particularly dedicated and devoted man. I think there were some signs of motion occasionally, a finger lifted during that time or whatever. But after 20 years, Prince al-Waleed died. We're not absolutely sure whether they simply said, okay, enough is enough in the hospital, or whether he simply went. But I thought I would take a look at his energy, go into his crossover and see what it was like for him. And when I did, he was standing in a pair of stirrups, strangely holding on to what looked like reins initially, as though he was riding a horse, but there was no horse. It felt like suspended animation, which is, I suppose, what a coma is. The reins he was holding stretched out before him into a light, a distant light. That was life. That was the outside world. He was some distance back, standing on these stirrups and just staring at the light. Occasionally I felt a sort of trembling in the reins. Maybe it was a response to treatment, love, prayers, maybe. But he felt something internally. His consciousness registered, and that will be the motion that they saw on the outside, I assume. Fascinatingly, below the light, there was some kind of drum, metal drum, obviously metaphorically, that was turning and turning and turning, and the reins went under it. They didn't go directly into the light, I discovered. They went under the drum being kept in place by the drum, and up and out into the light. When things turn and turn and turn in the pictures, it usually represents routine, week in, week out, the same thing. So maybe that's what was keeping him alive. That was the routine of medical treatment, of love even, of prayer. And when something happened to the drum, that shook the reins slightly. And he felt that, and maybe responded accordingly. When I went into his consciousness and looked out at the light, thinking maybe he was longing to reach it, maybe he was simply biding his time and would get there. When I looked at that light, it was replicated, echoed, down here. So there was the light, and there was another light down here. And there was a smudge between them. He was seeing too. The original, and then this strange, blurred echo of it. And it suggested to me that even if he had come around, which would have delighted his family and all those who'd been praying for him, if he had come to, the brain damage would have been permanent. He essentially wasn't seeing straight. He wasn't processing what he was seeing correctly in his consciousness. And so it probably wouldn't have been advantageous for him. And there would have had to be tremendous amount of care. Not that his family wouldn't have wanted to do that. His father loved him that much. They would have taken care of him. But in terms of the prince, it does seem as though he would have, had he come back into the world and started functioning again, been functioning in a distorted way that would have made life very, very difficult. But at some point, the drum stopped turning, which made me think they had turned off the machines, but that's not what I read. I read he died and then they turned off the machines. But it felt like the drum stopped turning or slowed down. And the fact that it either stopped or slowed down meant that the tension in the reins altered. There was slack now. And he came off the stirrups and fell down. But such was the nature of this metaphorical, symbolic environment that he was in, that he simply let go of the ropes, the reins, and slid down. The path was curved to catch him. And he slid down, and it brought him to a kind of peak that broke his fall. Beyond the peak, there was light. This gave me so much inspiration in terms of trusting the universe. Our egos want to control how everything goes. We want it to happen in a certain way that accords with our hopes and expectations, of course. But in spirit, that's not the way it works. And he let go, finally, and the universe caught him in its arms, essentially. Grace was there for him and scooped him up gently and brought him to this ridge where he could look beyond and see the light. He didn't just fall into the light. It broke his fall. It broke his slide. Once he had assimilated, he went over the ridge and then down, and he ended up in that cave that I always see. That's symbolic and not really there, but it tells me that the person has finally died. And when he got there, in the pictures, he didn't get up. He was on hands and knees, gasping and sputtering, like a drowning man who at the very last second is pulled out of the water onto a boat and finds he can breathe again. And now he felt the release of all his burdens, the injuries, the restriction, the perpetual nature of the turning drum, and so on. And here was his freedom, finally. When he rolled over onto his back, obviously in consciousness, metaphorically in the pictures, he rolled over onto his back and bawled. Bawled and bawled with relief at finally having his freedom. This calls into question for me an issue which has come up a couple of times on this channel about natural longevity, whether there is a time for us to go, written into our soul contract. And although modern medicine can work miracles and extend lives, and it does very often, in the case of somebody who is in a vegetative state, the fact that we can retain their life force and keep them present in the mortal world in form may counter the terms of their soul contract, when the soul knows that it has to go for whatever reason. Maybe it has to be somewhere else. And in the prince's case, maybe he was only meant to be in form for a certain number of years. But thanks to the miracle of medicine, he was kept alive for so much longer. And then there's the question of who was he kept alive for? For his loving family, who never wanted to see anything like this happen to him and certainly didn't want to let him go, understandably. Or for him, in the hope and honest expectation that there would be a divine miracle and that he would come back to life. But as I said, when I went into his consciousness and looked out, whatever had happened to him with the cerebral hemorrhaging and whatever else happened, it had distorted his awareness to such an extent that he would not have been a healthy, fully functioning young man, and would have probably needed care anyway for the rest of his days. When he lay on his back, symbolically, in the pictures, bawling, that felt like an expression of release for his soul. Like, finally, I am free to move on to the next phase. Yes, the life force can be sustained and retained, but does that amount to an infringement of the terms of a person's soul contract, even if it's done out of sheer love and caring? That drum that was constantly turning was the method used to keep him where he was. And the moment that slowed down, why ever it did slow down, the moment that slowed down and stopped, the reins went slack, he fell, and the universe was allowed to do its work. Grace stepped in, scooped him up, and took care of him, allowing his soul to move into the light and away. I guess we just have to learn to trust the universe. When our egos are saying, we can do something, we can control this. But maybe we're not meant to control these things. Maybe, as we found so many times with these transitions, maybe surrender and letting go are what's required of us for our soul contract for this particular lifetime to be fulfilled. And if we interfere in that, even with the best intentions, if we interfere in somebody else's soul contract, we may be starving them of vital cosmic energy that they need to move on to the next phase of their evolution. None of us has the credentials to give an authoritative view on that. We kind of have to go through it in order to know. But it's certainly very intriguing. And it's lovely to know that every effort was made on the mortal side to keep him present in form with love and prayers and the best treatment money could buy. But also nice to know that when we're ready, grace is standing by, waiting to escort us to the next stage of our cosmic adventure. Amazing. That's what I learned from Prince al-Waleed. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.